"I bet you can't translate this," laughed the CEO. But the maid shut him up. The glass walls of the boardroom glittered with the morning sun, reflecting the sharp suits and polished shoes of men and women who measured their worth by money, stocks, and deals worth millions. At the head of the table sat Richard Marlowe, a 41-year-old CEO who carried himself like a king. He had built his image on control and dominance, and every person in that room knew he was a man who valued fortune over feelings. His watch alone could pay for a family's entire year of living. The air buzzed with anticipation as investors from Europe and Asia gathered, waiting for Richard to unveil his next big move. He leaned back in his leather chair, a smug smile pulling at his lips. To him, the world was a chessboard, and he was always several moves ahead. Yet, in the corner of the room, almost invisible, a woman moved quietly with her cleaning cart. Her uniform was simple, her steps careful, her eyes lowered. She was the kind of person people often overlooked, as if she blended into the walls she dusted. Her name was Evelyn, a 37-year-old maid whose presence in that expensive boardroom seemed almost out of place. Richard noticed her. Not because he respected her, but because he saw in her an opportunity for entertainment. His eyes sparkled with mischief. He had always enjoyed humiliating those he considered beneath him. It made him feel even richer, even more powerful. Before we dive deeper into this journey, hit the like button, subscribe, and comment below where you're watching from. We love hearing your stories too. As he shuffled through his notes, he suddenly switched languages, dropping a complex sentence in flawless French. Investors chuckled politely, some nodding in understanding, others pretending to follow. Then Richard's gaze turned sharply toward Evelyn. "I bet you can't translate this," he said loudly, his voice echoing through the room. Laughter followed, bouncing between the glass walls. A few executives forced smiles, while others lowered their eyes, uncomfortable. But no one dared to challenge the millionaire CEO. Evelyn froze. Her hands tightened on the handle of her cart. She wasn't there to be part of their world, she was there to clean it. Yet now, all eyes fell on her, waiting to see her squirm, waiting to laugh at her silence. Richard leaned forward, his grin widening. "Come on," he teased. "Let's see if our maid has any secret talents. Translate it for us." The room felt suddenly colder. Evelyn's chest rose and fell with measured breaths. She could hear the muffled snickers, could feel the weight of the fortune that surrounded her, the suits, the gold watches, the diamonds glinting on rings. To them, she was furniture. Disposable. For a moment, she considered lowering her gaze and saying nothing. It would be easier. But deep inside, something stirred. A quiet strength she had buried long ago. She remembered late nights with textbooks, long before life had forced her into scrubbing floors instead of chasing dreams. Silence stretched on. The investors leaned closer, curiosity mixing with unease. Richard drummed his fingers on the table, hungry for her embarrassment. But then, Evelyn slowly lifted her head. Her dark eyes met his. And in that single look, the power shifted, if only slightly. The laughter faded into nervous coughs, the weight of the moment pressing down like a storm about to break. Everyone waited for her next move, their breath caught between disbelief and anticipation. And just as Richard prepared to mock her again, Evelyn's lips parted, ready to speak. The boardroom hung on her silence, not yet knowing that her answer would shake the very foundation of the millionaire's pride. The air in the boardroom had shifted. A few seconds ago, it was filled with easy laughter and the smug rhythm of Richard Marlowe's arrogance. Now it was heavy, fragile, as if everyone feared that even the sound of breathing might shatter the tension. The maid stood still, her cart beside her, one hand resting on the polished handle. Her back was straight, her chin raised just enough to show that she wasn't about to crumble. Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, his smirk still plastered on his face. "What's wrong?" he asked, raising his voice so that every investor could hear. "Lost your words already? That's what happens when you play in a rich man's world. Money talks. Fortune talks. But maids? They stay quiet." His words were sharp, intended to sting, to remind her of her place. A ripple of awkward laughter passed through the table, but it didn't carry the same confidence as before. Some of the executives shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting from Richard to Evelyn. They were used to the CEO's arrogance, but this felt different. It wasn't witty. It wasn't clever. It was cruel. Evelyn's fingers tapped once against the handle of her cart. Her mind raced. She could let it pass, let the moment dissolve into laughter and whispers about the poor maid. That was what Richard wanted. But something inside her refused to break. She remembered all the time she had been told she didn't belong. At school she couldn't afford, in interviews that never called her back, in conversations where her opinion was dismissed before she even finished her sentence. And now, in this room filled with rich men and women who measured respect in dollar signs, she stood on the edge of another humiliation. Richard turned toward the investors, his smile broadening. See? Not even a word. That's the difference between those who build fortunes and those who sweep them away. His voice dripped with satisfaction, like a man certain he had already won. But Evelyn's silence wasn't weakness, it was gathering strength. She inhaled deeply, her heart pounding in her chest, the rhythm of courage louder than the millionaire's laughter. The men in suits shifted, unsure whether to join Richard's mockery or to wait. One of the investors, a tall man with silver hair, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should return to the agenda," he said softly, trying to steer the conversation back to the business at hand. But Richard waved him off with the arrogance of someone who thought money gave him the right to control every room he entered. "No, Richard said, chuckling. "Let's not rush. This is entertainment. Let's give our cleaning lady the stage. Come on, translate. Or admit you can't." The words sliced through the room, and Evelyn felt them burn. But rather than push her down, they lifted her. Her silence stretched, and in that silence, the power shifted again, not to Richard but to her. The longer she waited, the more obvious his cruelty became. The investors were no longer laughing. Some avoided his eyes altogether. They weren't sure what was about to happen, but they sensed it wouldn't end as Richard expected. Evelyn lifted her head a fraction higher. Her eyes locked on his, unflinching. In them there was no anger, no hatred, only quiet resolve. It was enough to make even Richard hesitate for a fraction of a second. The room seemed to lean toward her, as though every breath, every heartbeat, belonged to her next word. She was ready to break the silence. The maid's lips parted, and the first sound slipped from her throat, about to turn the millionaire's cruel laughter into something far more dangerous: silence. The sound of her voice broke through the room like a note of music in a funeral. Calm, steady, deliberate. Evelyn began to speak in French, her accent smooth, her words crisp and clear. For a moment, the executives stared in disbelief, unsure if they had heard correctly. But as the sentence flowed effortlessly from her lips, every doubt was erased. She didn't just repeat what Richard had said, she translated it with precision, her tone carrying the authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Even the foreign investors leaned forward, surprised and intrigued. Richard's smirk faltered. His laugh, which had once filled the room so easily, now caught in his throat. He shifted in his chair, drumming his fingers nervously against the polished wood of the table. He hadn't expected this. In his world of money, fortune, and control, people always played their assigned roles. And maids weren't supposed to speak back, much less speak in a language that only the elite were expected to know. The room grew more silent with each word she spoke, her voice carrying not only meaning but dignity. There was no hesitation, no sign of doubt. She wasn't showing off, she was simply revealing the truth of who she was, a truth that had been buried beneath years of invisibility. When she finished, she let the words linger in the air, refusing to rush or look away. She turned her gaze directly at Richard, her dark eyes meeting his gray ones. And then she said, in flawless English, "Did I get it right?" The question was simple, but it was sharper than any insult. The investors shifted in their chairs, some hiding their smiles, others unable to mask their admiration. A few nodded in approval, silently impressed by her composure. Richard forced a laugh, though it was weaker this time, brittle and strained. Well, he said, "our maid has a trick up her sleeve." How unexpected. He tried to sound amused, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a tension that betrayed his discomfort. Evelyn didn't reply. She stood still, calm, allowing the silence to expose him. Her strength was no longer hidden, it was undeniable, and the room felt it. For the first time, the balance of power tilted. Richard leaned forward, trying to regain control. "All right, then," he said. "Translate this." He switched to German, throwing another sentence across the table like a challenge. His voice carried the arrogance of a millionaire used to winning every game. Evelyn did not flinch. She repeated the words smoothly in English, her tone unwavering. The executives gasped softly, whispers passing between them. 2 languages. 2 flawless translations. Richard's smile slipped further. He hadn't realized it yet, but the laughter he had tried to summon had turned into something else entirely, respect for the woman he had tried to humiliate. Evelyn paused, letting the silence breathe again. Then she added, her voice calm but firm, "You should be careful what you say in a room full of people who actually understand you." The words landed like thunder. A wave of tension rolled through the room. No one laughed this time. No one dared. Richard sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing, his fortune suddenly feeling smaller than the authority that radiated from the maid he had mocked. And then, as if the universe itself wanted to test him further, one of the foreign investors turned toward Evelyn and spoke directly to her, in his native tongue. The investor's words, flowing rapidly in a language Evelyn had long studied, could have frozen anyone else in the room. But she didn't flinch. Her fingers tightened briefly on the edge of her cart for balance, and then she began to translate smoothly, her voice confident, her tone precise. Each sentence carried meaning far beyond mere words. It carried authority, clarity, and insight. As she spoke, Richard's expression tightened. This was no longer a simple translation. Evelyn was demonstrating knowledge and intelligence that threatened to expose his arrogance. The executives and investors listened, some leaning closer, captivated by her skill. She didn't just convey information, she revealed a perspective that no one in that room had considered. Evelyn paused momentarily, letting the weight of her words settle. Then she shared a detail that no one expected, her background. "Before I worked here," she said, "I spent years studying languages and international business, preparing for opportunities one never imagined I would have. Life, however, had other plans. I had to take work that paid the bills, but that never erased what I learned." Her voice carried neither bitterness nor complaint, only a quiet, unshakable truth. The room seemed to still entirely. Some executives glanced at each other, their expressions a mixture of surprise and respect. Investors nodded, impressed by her composure and the depth of her knowledge. Even the younger assistants, usually unnoticed, exchanged astonished looks. Richard leaned forward, attempting to regain control, but the more he tried to interject, the more awkward he became. His usual arsenal of sarcasm and intimidation was failing him. Evelyn's calm authority overshadowed him. She was no longer a maid invisible to the eyes of the wealthy. She was a professional, a scholar, a woman whose knowledge could influence fortunes. "You see," she continued, "language is not only words. It's understanding culture, context, and the subtle dynamics that govern every deal in a global market. If you dismiss someone based solely on their role or station, you risk losing far more than money. You risk losing credibility and opportunity." Richard's fingers twitched on the table. He wanted to interrupt, to mock, to reassert his millionaire dominance. But the room no longer allowed it. The executives, the investors, even some of his closest advisors, now waited. The balance had shifted. One of the investors, a tall man with an aura of quiet authority, leaned forward. "Your insight is invaluable," he said, turning to Evelyn. "We need someone with your skill to ensure this deal's success. Can you assist with the next part of our discussion?" The words struck the room like lightning. All eyes moved between Evelyn and Richard. He tried to hide his shock, forcing a tight-lipped smile, but it was too late. The moment had passed where he controlled the narrative. Evelyn's intellect and composure had rewritten it entirely. Evelyn, for the first time in years, allowed herself a small private smile. Her past, long hidden, was now her armor and her key. Every late night spent studying, every sacrifice made to survive, had led to this moment. She was no longer invisible. She had transformed from someone the rich thought they could laugh at into someone whose words could change the direction of multi-million-dollar negotiations. Richard opened his mouth, searching for something, anything, to regain dominance. But the words died on his tongue. He realized, painfully, that the power in the room no longer resided with him. The investors, fully captivated, looked to Evelyn for guidance. They weren't just impressed, they trusted her insight, her judgment, her presence. The room had shifted from an arena of mockery to a stage where Evelyn now commanded attention and respect. And just as Richard attempted one final jab, a crucial piece of information came to light, one that would reveal a secret and change everything about the negotiation, placing Evelyn directly in control of the fortune everyone had assumed belonged solely to the millionaire CEO. The room had grown tense, almost electric. The investor's attention was now entirely on Evelyn, her presence commanding a weight that no millionaire could manufacture. Richard Marlowe shifted uncomfortably in his chair, realizing that the control he had wielded effortlessly for years was slipping through his fingers. His fortune, his status, all the power symbolized by the rich trappings around him, felt suddenly hollow in comparison to the authority radiating from a woman he had once dismissed as invisible. Evelyn took a deep breath and turned back to the foreign investor who had spoken earlier. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. Her translations were precise, her tone measured, but there was an undercurrent of insight that left the boardroom hanging on every word. She conveyed not only meaning but context, cultural nuance, and subtle warnings that could influence the outcome of the multi-million-dollar deal. Every sentence she spoke strengthened her position, quietly undermining Richard's. Then came the revelation, a twist no one had anticipated. While translating, Evelyn uncovered an inconsistency in Richard's figures, a discrepancy the investors had failed to notice. The error wasn't huge, but in the world of fortune, credibility was everything. She explained it carefully, showing the potential risks and, more importantly, offering a solution that would secure their interests while preserving Richard's reputation. The room fell silent as her words landed. Richard's jaw tightened. He wanted to laugh, to dismiss her, but the collective gaze of the investors held him in check. They weren't laughing anymore, they were calculating, weighing her insight, recognizing her authority. One investor, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "This is exceptional," he said, directing his attention fully to Evelyn. "We didn't expect this level of insight from someone outside our circle, but your intervention could save the entire negotiation. Would you consider joining us as a consultant?" Evelyn paused. She felt a rush of emotion, the culmination of years of unseen effort, struggle, and sacrifice. To be acknowledged not as a maid, but as a professional whose intelligence could sway millions, was a validation she had scarcely allowed herself to hope for. Richard's attempt to interject failed. His voice, once commanding, now sounded small and strained. He realized that in mocking her, he had underestimated not just Evelyn, but the very forces of perception, respect, and human dignity that money could never fully control. Evelyn met his eyes calmly. "I'm willing to help," she said, her voice steady. "But I expect to be treated with the same respect as anyone else in this room. My role is to ensure success, not to be ignored or laughed at." The investors nodded approvingly, their confidence in her judgment growing by the second. Richard's smirk had disappeared entirely, replaced by a tense, tight-lipped frown. The millionaire who had once laughed at her was now acutely aware that he had been outmaneuvered, not by cunning or money, but by knowledge, composure, and integrity. It was more than a personal victory. It was a transformation. Evelyn, the woman who had been invisible in the corners of boardrooms and corridors, now stood at the center of influence. Her past hardships had prepared her for this exact moment, and her courage had rewritten the rules of the game. The boardroom was still, each person absorbing the reality of what had just occurred. Richard, for all his wealth, realized that his power depended on perception, and that perception had shifted irrevocably. Evelyn had taken what was meant to humiliate her and turned it into an unparalleled demonstration of competence and respect. The investors smiled, some even shaking their heads in astonishment. Evelyn had not just salvaged the deal, she had strengthened it, securing millions of dollars and the trust of influential figures who might have otherwise doubted the outcome. And then, the lead investor turned to her, extending a hand with a proposition, a permanent role in guiding the company's most critical negotiations, a position of influence that Richard had assumed only he could hold. For the first time, Evelyn's eyes flicked toward him, not with fear, but with quiet triumph. The silence that followed the investor's offer was thick, almost suffocating. Evelyn's words had reshaped the entire boardroom dynamic, and Richard Marlowe felt it keenly. For years, his authority had been unchallenged, his sharp mind matched only by the fortune he amassed. Yet here he sat, a man of wealth and power, suddenly exposed by a woman he had considered beneath notice. Richard tried to speak, his voice attempting the same confidence that had always commanded attention. "Well, Evelyn," he said, forcing a tight smile, "I suppose you've surprised us all." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. His usual charm, that aura of billionaire dominance, failed to mask the sting of being outshone. Evelyn met his gaze evenly, her calmness a stark contrast to his faltering composure. "I only did what was necessary to ensure success," she said. Her tone was firm but free of malice. There was no gloating, no need for revenge. Her victory was in recognition, in respect earned, not in crushing someone else's pride. The investors, still captivated, nodded approvingly, some exchanging impressed glances. They were watching a true leader emerge, not one who flaunted wealth or demanded obedience, but one who combined knowledge, clarity, and courage. They had expected a minor interruption in the routine of Richard's control. Instead, they had witnessed a masterful shift in influence. Richard clenched his fists subtly under the table, the billionaire ego bruised but unwilling to break completely. He had underestimated the quiet force of intellect, composure, and dignity. He realized the power he assumed came from more than money. It came from people's perception, and that perception had changed irrevocably. The boardroom's eyes no longer followed his every word unquestioningly. They now followed Evelyn's guidance. He shifted in his chair, his mind racing through every interaction of the morning. Every joke at her expense, every sarcastic remark, every dismissive glance, it had all contributed to this moment. And yet, he could do nothing to reclaim it. He was rich, yes. A millionaire many times over. But that wealth could not undo the authority he had lost to someone he had mocked. Evelyn moved closer to the table, the quiet confidence in her steps speaking volumes. "If we approach this negotiation carefully," she said, "we can secure a stronger outcome for all parties involved. The investors will leave satisfied, the company will prosper, and every risk we've identified will be mitigated." Her words were simple but commanding, filled with clarity and foresight that had the room leaning in, attentive to every syllable. Richard opened his mouth again, trying to interject with authority, but the room ignored him. The investors were focused entirely on Evelyn, hanging on her every word. He realized that in trying to humiliate her, he had elevated her beyond expectation, and diminished himself in the process. The irony was sharp, bitter, and unavoidable. A few executives, who had been silent observers until now, began nodding, clearly valuing Evelyn's input. Some even whispered to one another, quietly acknowledging that her insight had just saved millions of dollars. Richard watched helplessly as the respect he had always commanded was quietly redirected toward the very woman he had sought to mock. Evelyn's eyes flicked toward him briefly, not with malice, but with unmistakable confidence. The message was clear: he no longer controlled the narrative. She had stepped into a space he had assumed belonged only to him, and had done so without arrogance, without drama, with nothing but skill and integrity. The room was transformed. What had begun as a scene of potential humiliation for a maid had become a masterclass in quiet power and respect. Richard understood, finally, that authority built on wealth alone was fragile. True influence, he realized too late, came from knowledge, courage, and the ability to command attention without fear. Evelyn leaned slightly forward, her calm voice carrying a final, cutting remark, one that left Richard speechless and the boardroom silently acknowledging who truly held the power in that room. The boardroom was still. The air hummed with a tension that was no longer uncomfortable, but expectant, almost reverent. Investors and executives leaned in, fully aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Evelyn's presence had shifted the room's energy, her intellect and calm authority replacing the tension that had once belonged entirely to Richard Marlowe. The millionaire CEO sat rigidly in his chair, his usual confidence fractured, forced into quiet reflection. Evelyn took a slow, deliberate breath, allowing her next words to carry weight without haste. "We are not defined solely by our roles, by the titles we hold, or by the money in our accounts," she began, her voice calm but commanding. "We are defined by what we choose to do when opportunity meets courage, when respect meets challenge." She paused, letting the truth of her words settle on every listener, from the youngest assistant to the most seasoned investor. Her gaze swept across the room. Every eye was fixed on her, every mind silently acknowledging the magnitude of what had just occurred. Evelyn had not only translated words, she had translated power itself. The investors who had arrived uncertain now saw clarity. The executives who had been complicit in Richard's arrogance now saw integrity. And Richard himself, though silent, could no longer ignore the lesson. Wealth without respect and humility was fragile, and underestimating someone's knowledge and humanity could cost far more than money ever could. One of the foreign investors, the same who had offered her the consultant role, spoke quietly but firmly, directing his words to everyone in the room. "This woman has just ensured the success of this deal, and she has done it with clarity, expertise, and composure. We have gained not just guidance, but trust. And trust, more than fortune, is what drives every lasting enterprise." Evelyn felt a quiet surge of emotion but remained poised. Years of work, study, sacrifice, and unseen struggle had led to this moment. She had transformed what could have been a public humiliation into a defining triumph, a demonstration of intelligence, courage, and dignity. She understood fully that her value had never been determined by her occupation or station. It had been proven in her actions, in her knowledge, and in her unwavering composure under pressure. Richard, still seated, allowed himself a slow exhale. The lesson had hit harder than he expected. He had laughed, assuming superiority based on wealth and title, but the room now acknowledged a truth he could not ignore. Fortune alone does not command respect. Respect is earned, and it can never be purchased. Evelyn turned her attention back to the investors, her demeanor professional, calm, yet undeniably powerful. "I am willing to assist further," she said, "to ensure that every decision is informed, every risk accounted for, and every opportunity maximized. But it must be done with respect for every person involved, regardless of their position or past circumstances." The room erupted into quiet but enthusiastic approval. Nods, smiles, and murmurs of agreement spread like a ripple across the polished surfaces. Evelyn had done more than secure a deal. She had reshaped perceptions, challenged preconceptions, and reminded everyone present that true worth is measured by intellect, integrity, and courage, not merely by money or title. Richard finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "You've exceeded expectations," he admitted, the words tasting strange yet true. There was no bitterness in Evelyn's eyes, only recognition that the man before her was learning a lesson she had always known. As the meeting concluded, Evelyn gathered her cart, her movements calm and deliberate. Investors and executives offered quiet applause and sincere thanks. Her journey had begun in silence, in corners of boardrooms, unnoticed and underestimated, and it ended in acknowledgement, trust, and opportunity. The maid had become an indispensable voice. She paused at the door, looking back at Richard one last time. There was no mockery in her eyes, only quiet triumph and unspoken understanding. True power is measured by courage, knowledge, and the ability to rise above humiliation. The millionaire had learned it the hard way, and she had proven it effortlessly. In a world obsessed with money and fortune, it is courage, intellect, and integrity that truly define success. Respect is earned, not bought, and the strength to stand up, even when overlooked, can change destinies. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, share this video and tell us in the comments, what part of this journey moved you the most? There's another story waiting for you, and I'm sure it will change the way you see the world. Thank you for watching and see you soon.